Maybe it's just me, but I can't help the feeling that every falling block puzzle game exists in the long shadow cast by Alexei Pajitnov's Tetris. That's because Tetris is an icon. It's well known enough that even folks who aren't necessarily into video games will look at one that halfway resembles it and say, "Oh, that's Tetris." And it really takes some beating when it comes to accessibility. It's the kind of game you can come to with no prior experience and start playing more or less immediately. So of course, it was always going to spawn imitators. But it's important to recognise that the template laid down by Tetris isn't the only one for these kinds of games to follow. Over time, other games have added their own unique spin on its basic gameplay concepts, and perhaps the next most influential game in the genre is Sega's Columns. Designed by programmer Jay Geertsen in 1989 and sold to Sega in 1990, Columns would become the company's direct answer to Tetris, finding itself retooled for release as an arcade machine and gracing most of their home consoles. But it's perhaps the 1990 Megadrive release that's best remembered, with that version being touted as the definitive one, given the Megadrive's status as Sega's most powerful home console at the time. The great conundrum for developers with the falling block puzzle genre, much as it is with any kind of video game, is how to come up with something that plays and feels differently to the competition. And Sega's Columns, at the very least, scores points for establishing itself as a marked departure from the simple play mechanics found at work in its next nearest rival. Where everyone's favourite Russian block tumbler tasks you to rotate and drop falling shapes to make lines of connected blocks, Columns focuses instead on colours, and that translates to a game that requires a slightly different approach from its players. The game is played by manipulating vertically stacked triplets of gemstones as they descend from the top of the play area. Thumbing one of the Megadrive joypad's 3 buttons cycles the order they're arranged in, and the idea is to guide the falling stack into the bottom of the screen to match up with others that have accumulated there to make a line of 3 or more of the same colour, whereupon they'll disappear. But where Tetris required you to make exclusively horizontal lines, in Columns you can make them vertically and diagonally as well. The key to scoring big is to create multiple lines at the same time, and trigger combos as gems fall into the spaces left by those you've just removed, creating chain reactions. The danger is that if you fail to make regular matches, the well your gemstones are falling into will fill up, giving you less room to manoeuvre, and the longer you play, the faster the pace of the game becomes. Once your stack of accumulated gems reaches the top of the well, it's game over. Could it really be any simpler? I always find these falling block puzzle games really tricky to pass judgment on, partly because they're not really my jam and only really grab my attention if they're done extremely well, but also because they exist in a genre that's so well established with regard to general design and gameplay that something has to go really wrong for them to turn out badly. Where Columns is concerned, I think it definitely does enough to present itself as a credible and desirable alternative to Tetris. It's sufficiently different that you don't feel like you might as well be playing Tetris instead, and in that respect, it's an important game in its genre. I've seen just as many variations on this particular format of the falling block puzzle as I have the one that's laid out by its famous forerunner, and on the Megadrive, players are afforded plenty of options to play the game just how they want to. From the main menu, you're given the option to jump straight into the arcade mode, which I personally feel is the least appealing option, for reasons I'll get into in a moment, or dive into the menu, where you can select different game modes specific to this console version. These include more approachable single and 2-player modes, as well as the option to play Flash Columns, an alternative game style where the object is to eliminate a single flashing gemstone from an already partially filled well. Whichever style of gameplay you opt for, Columns is pretty much as simple to grasp as you'd expect. All you have to do is keep stacking and matching gems and stringing together combos for as long as you can in hopes of amassing as high a score as possible, until the pace of play becomes too fast for you to keep up with, or you inevitably make a mistake that leads to the well filling up. What counts is how well you play before you get to that point, and how long you can keep yourself in the game. That requires good hand-to-eye coordination, arguably more than Tetris does, because of the extra dimension colour matching adds to the game. And you'll need good reflexes too, because you'll find yourself making snap decisions about where and how to place your gems, sometimes on a split second's notice as the pace of play gets faster. There's a wealth of settings you can tweak to tailor your game to your own preference, including a choice of background music, overall difficulty, the option to play a time trial where you aim for the best score within a set time limit, or in flash mode, how high the well is filled with gemstones when you start. And this degree of game customization is really Column's saving grace, because if all there was on this cartridge was the arcade mode, I think its legacy would be far less impressive. I've got two main issues with the arcade mode. One is the way its scoring works. When you begin a new game, you can select one of 3 difficulty levels. Setting out on the easiest allows you to begin at a relaxed pace, but the other 2 levels kick things off at progressively faster speeds. That's not a problem in itself, but the fact that these higher difficulty settings start you off with a pretty hefty point score has a huge impact on this play mode. Start on medium difficulty and you'll get a 20,000 point score before you begin. Starting on the hardest will earn you an attendance bonus of 50,000 points. Yes, you get these points just for selecting the corresponding setting. I don't like this, simply because it ties high scores, the raison d'etre of this entire game mode, into playing at these settings, and in practice this means that even a short, poorly played game on the hardest setting scores significantly better than a longer, well played one on the easiest. At least that's what I found as I was playing Columns again prior to writing this review. Maybe I just suck. I have to confess that I've never clapped eyes on a Columns arcade machine in the wild, at least not as of the time of my writing this review, so I have no idea if this is a holdover from the coin-op version. I can see that it would make sense if it was though, because it might be a way to encourage players who want a spot on the high score table to shovel coins into it, and the faster play speeds coupled with a big advanced points bonus might encourage shorter games and more attempts. But in the context of a Megadrive port, it seems a bit odd, especially given that this is the most readily accessible play option on the title screen. My other issue with this mode of play is that it's just not a particularly good way to play Columns at home. It's geared toward a more immediate style of play with a more rapidly escalating pace, and the controls aren't really 100% suited to precise play at the speeds it eventually gets up to. D-pad inputs are just oversensitive enough that when things start to get frantic, it's frustratingly easy to misalign a stack of gems or shuffle it unintentionally in a panic, and then it's game over. It's a problem that's mitigated slightly by the leeway you're afforded to shift a stack or reshuffle it for just an instant after it lands, but you can't always rely on that to get you out of a fix. You're basically only ever going to get so far in this mode before your own ability is overtaken by the game's speed and those touchy controls. Your mileage may vary here of course, but to my way of thinking, this particular mode's appeal is pretty limited as a result. Thankfully, the other variants of the game you can play are much more satisfying, and that huge range of tweakable settings means that you're bound to find a way to play the game that suits you personally. After some tinkering, I found that tailoring these for a more relaxed pace gave me a sense that I was really getting the most from the game, and that was when I started to feel like I was enjoying it properly. The time trial and flash modes that I briefly mentioned before especially held my interest, because they introduce clearly defined objectives to the basic Columns gameplay formula. Maybe it's just so much personal preference talking here, but there's something about getting better scores and clear times in those modes that just feels more satisfying and meaningful. However you slice it, playing Columns like this, it just has that more classic feel that you expect from this kind of game. Mechanically, nothing is any different from how things work in the arcade mode. Everything just feels more manageable and more conducive to longer play sessions in pursuit of better scores. And call me crazy, that flyaway quality the controls have in arcade mode seems much less noticeable here. Considered as an alternative to Tetris, Columns stands as a laudable step toward broadening the scope of its genre. It represents enough of a variation on the formula that it feels original rather than being a shallow rip-off, and I strongly suspect that's what must have convinced Sega it was worth putting their name to. Tellingly, when you look at these kinds of games, there aren't many that substantially deviate from or add anything to the divergent blueprints established by the two games. If I'm completely honest though, there's a reason I mentioned Tetris a few times in this review, and that would simply be that I don't think Columns is quite as good. It's just never grabbed me in quite the same way, and I think that's down to nothing more than the simple differences in their play mechanics. For some reason, I prefer rotating blocks to shuffling gemstones. That's just how my gaming brain is wired up. I have no problem conceding that Columns is still a really fine game though. Bypass the dubious arcade mode and explore everything else it has to offer, and this Mega Drive version is more than worth spending some time with.